What just happened? I felt something strange.
If you look at the entire Castlevania timeline, there's one particular thing which is quite baffling. It's strange to see, but there is something surely missing from the Belmont lineage. I mean, the lore jumps from Leon Belmont in 1094 and then straight to Trevor Belmont in 1476 with almost nothing in between. And that's nearly 4 centuries of vacuum in Belmont history. Lament of Innocence introduced the vampire killer and the origins of the Belmont/Dracula feud. But then all of a sudden, we witness a full-scale war generations later. I mean, a lot of things must have happened in between that time, right? But chronology just doesn't fill that gap. And as a fan, that gap haunts me. It almost feels like a deliberately sealed coffin, which is stuffed with forgotten memories of the Belmont lineage. But today, I'll open that coffin for you. And then let's figure out the missing history between Lament of Innocence and Castlevania 3.
I shall take your soul!
So, how big is the gap between Leon and Trevor? Well, there's a massive chronological leap between Leon Belmont and Trevor Belmont. Leon's story started in 1094 when he founded the Belmont vampire hunting clan. Vampire hunting was not always a Belmont tradition. Everything changes when Leon's wife Sarah is bitten by a vampire. This personal tragedy shaped Leon's destiny as the vampire killer. On the other hand, Trevor's era began in 1476. When the Belmont legacy as a vampire hunter was already established. That's a whopping 382 years gap. As I said, something must have happened in this gap which kept fueling the rivalry between Belmont and the vampire. Because till the time of Trevor, vampire hunting had become an inherited duty for the Belmont. Leon Belmont began as a knight who lost his fiancée and then renounced his chivalric position so that he could fight the vampire. But centuries later, his direct blood descendant, Trevor, is already a seasoned vampire hunter. His legacy is not born out of personal revenge. But the story doesn't just skip centuries randomly. By doing so, it also compresses history into key turning points of events. Leon started the original feud with vampires, but by the time of Trevor, the vampire crisis had already become global. But that story is missing from the chronological order. And honestly, this narrative vacuum is baffling, but also quite fascinating. From Leon to Trevor, Belmonts must have existed and fought the vampires and passed down the vampire killer across generations. And of course, Dracula also must have grown in power and influence during that time. It all started with Leon's vow and the creation of the vampire killer, and then came Dracula's war against humanity. But what lies between these events is the actual evolution of myth into history. This gap also shifts the scale of the story. Leon's story feels quite personal and tragic because it is driven by grief. But Trevor's story is already an epic which involves full-fledged armies and widespread destruction. In short, the gap between Leon and Trevor is not actually empty. It's intentionally designed so that a long lineage of unseen Belmont heroes emerge to counter Dracula, whose threat slowly became a global threat. Where it all started: Leon, Mathias, and the first vampire killer. As I told you, Leon's journey is the emotional foundation of the entire Castlevania saga. At the beginning of Lament of Innocence, Leon is loyal to the church and bound by duty as a respected knight. But all of that changes when his fiancée Sarah is kidnapped by the vampire Walter Bernard, and hence Leon is now forced into a supernatural conflict. He badly wants revenge. And thanks to his desire for revenge, we are introduced to several crucial figures which shape the Belmont legacy. Like Ronaldo Gandolfi, who was an alchemist who forged the first whip for Leon, which later became the vampire killer. Ronaldo was himself a victim of Walter Bernhardt, who had taken and vampirized his daughter. Already burning for revenge, he created the Whip of Alchemy, which could seriously damage the vampires, but not exactly kill them. Ronaldo also enchanted a magical gauntlet for Leon, which absorbed all magical attacks and also permitted him to utilize relics to his advantage. The Whip of Alchemy was later fused with the soul of Leon's dying fiancée. Leon also understands from Ronaldo that the vampire threat is not just about monsters. It was a whole system powered by bloodlines and dark ambition, and if he had to exact his revenge, he must build his own legacy. That moment arrived when Sarah found out that she had been bitten by a vampire. She sacrifices herself and her soul is bound to the whip, like this. the Whip of Alchemy becomes the Vampire Killer, a fully capable weapon to slay vampires and the bane of the undead. So, if you see, the Belmont legacy is literally born from Lisa's sacrifice. The Vampire Killer is not just a weapon, but it also carries the heavy burden of loss and responsibility. Then comes the real betrayal at the hands of Leon's friend Mathias Kronkfist. When Leon returned with the Vampire Killer, he saw Mathias had already manipulated events to gain power through the Crimson Stone and had become a vampire. That's the origins of Dracula right there. Mathias wanted Leon to also join him in the quest of immortality, but Leon refuses and takes a vow that the Belmont family would hunt down Mathias and all vampires forever. This vow becomes the central feud of the narrative. It was not just a hero versus vampire fight, but it was about friendship turned sour. From that moment onward, vampire killing was no longer optional for Belmont. It became a generational duty rooted in Leon's promise to destroy Mathias, who later became Dracula. Here, it's important to understand that Belmonts didn't become hunters for glory. Leon was a noble knight. He didn't have any business fighting the vampire, but he had to take up that vow. And since then, the Belmont-Dracula conflict has become a generational thing. Leon's story ends without a decisive victory in Lament of Innocence. Dracula manages to survive, but the feud still remains as the Belmont legacy is set in motion. The unresolved ending is the catalyst behind creating the centuries-long conflict, which will define the missing history. Leon might not have been exactly victorious, but he surely managed to start this curse of responsibility for his clan to hunt vampires in the generations to come. Jump cut to Trevor, the first big war with Dracula. Centuries later, Trevor Belmont's era becomes the time when the Belmont-Dracula conflict actually erupts into a full-scale war. The world has dramatically changed since Leon's era. The year is 1476, and by now, Dracula is no longer an emerging or hidden threat. Now, he has become a fully formidable force which is capable of waging open war against humanity. He unleashes armies of vampire which plunge Wallachia into. But it's interesting to see that by that time, the Belmont family had also become infamous for their supernatural power. Their power started to scare the ordinary people and led to their exile from Wallachia. Perhaps the centuries of vampire hunting had gradually transformed admiration for Belmonts into fear. But the Dracula threat was still real and was now getting closer. He has launched a continent-wide military offensive against humanity. His army of vampires moved with the explicit goal of exterminating humanity due to his rage and vengeance after the loss of Lisa. As Dracula's armies invaded Europe and even defeated the church, the threat became more real than ever. And then came the Uneasy Belmont alliance with the church, which was forced to request Belmont assistance despite the negative public sentiment. The church had already lost its military capability to fight against Dracula, and the last viable option now was Belmont intervention. By the way, this was the same church which had tolerated or even enabled the Belmont exile. But the irony was that now it depended on the Belmonts for survival. This was an alliance between fear and necessity. Trevor was a savior and an outcast at the same time. Imagine how tough it would have been to stop the catastrophic rise of Dracula. But Trevor also turns out to be quite smart. He knows the power of Dracula and starts forming his own alliances to counter the threat. For most of his life, Leon had fought alone, but now his distant successor was forced to form an alliance with Sypha Belnades, Grant Dynasty, and Alucard. That's because Trevor knows that Dracula's threat has now gone much beyond personal rivalry and has become a global crisis which must need collective action. And a full-scale campaign against Dracula begins in 1476, which becomes the first major documented Belmont victory over Dracula's large-scale assault. This is in line with the recurring nature of the Castlevania narrative. Dracula rises every time, and then Belmonts have to neutralize the threat, and the conflict goes on, repeating like this. But still, there is a huge contrast between Trevor and Leon. Leon was the founder and tragic hero of the story, but Trevor is the warrior with an already matured legacy. Leon was fighting for personal justice, while Trevor is fighting for the survival of the entire humanity. In many ways, Trevor's era feels like the end of centuries of crusade against the vampires and Dracula. In between all this time, the Belmont family has clearly honed its techniques and passed down knowledge to its future generations. Today, their reputation is strong enough in vampire killing, but Trevor is not the beginning of that famed Belmont heroism. He's just the first one to reach the apex of that heroism, the missing years nobody showed us. So, if all that happened, then why are there almost no games in the canon to fill that gap? Why any sort of material is absent between this time is one of the most intriguing mysteries of the franchise. But even if a documented Belmont lineage is not available during these centuries, it's only obvious that the generations must have inherited the vampire killer and trained in vampire hunting. After all, the Belmont reputation that Trevor has inherited could not have formed overnight. This missing history also makes me think about Dracula's development during that time. By 1476, he was already established as well. He was not some kind of an emerging villain, but he's a fully furnished Dark Lord who is capable of commanding armies and influencing world events. Gaining that level of power must have required at least centuries of growth. It means that the narrative gap is like a mythological incubation period where so many things must have happened simultaneously. The lore of the vampire killer also must have expanded. As Dracula's influence spread and the public fear of the supernatural power intensified, the church's relationship with the Belmonts became complicated. So, if you see, this absence of detail actually provides a lot of freedom for interpretation. As fans, we have the space to know about forgotten Belmont heroes and hidden Dracula encounters, and countless other small-scale conflicts that would have shaped the eventual war. And this is the pattern with almost every mythological storytelling. Foundational heroes and battles are introduced, and many further generations are not shown much, as if the gap is telling you that history also consists of legends as much as documented story. The missing Belmont centuries are not by mistake, but it is a deliberate storytelling. It gives us a sense of the history and legacy of the Belmont family. Trevor's story has been the climax of a long and unseen struggle, and that struggle has brought the Belmont story into folklore. What was Dracula doing all that time? So, while the Belmont lineage was becoming a folklore, let's find out what was Dracula doing. History might remember Dracula as a sudden catastrophe that suddenly erupted across Europe in 1476, but the truth is far more deep. Dracula is not a monster born overnight, but just the culmination of centuries of events that began in 1094. This is the story of Mathias, who was a knight and who fought alongside Leon Belmont. One time when he returned from the Crusades, Mathias found his beloved wife Elizabetha dying. This one event shattered his faith in God. The grief turned into so much hatred that it turned into rebellion against the divine itself. Mathias took upon the forbidden alchemy practices, which gave him the Crimson Stone. This relic was capable of absorbing vampire souls and granting immense power to the wielder. And then he started to plot his revenge with a cold precision. It was Mathias who manipulated Walter Bernhard into kidnapping Sarah. As a result, Leon was forced to confront Walter eventually, resulting in his death. Mathias absorbed Walter's power, and we come to know that all this tragedy was his plan to attain immortality. Leon rejects Mathias' philosophy and swears an eternal oath that the Belmont bloodline would destroy Dracula forever. This was the foundation of the Belmont-Dracula conflict. After this event, we didn't see Dracula for a long time. The centuries that follow between 1094 and the late 15th century are largely not present in the canon. Still, we can surely understand something from the lore. Mathias now has the power of the Crimson Stone, and he's continuously growing beyond ordinary vampirism. He has spent generations mastering the mechanics of immortality and developing his dark alchemy practices. Whether it's the art of soul absorption or gaining control over other monsters, Dracula had been quite busy during this period. In the meantime, he also constructed Castlevania. The castle functions as a demonic nexus for Dracula. In order to expand his influence, Mathias established a relation with death, which further elevated him beyond the status of vampire lord. Now, he became a cosmic villain capable of commanding forces at will. As the centuries passed, his transformation was not just magical, but also psychological. Mathias was trapped in a perpetual stage of grief, which slowly created his philosophy of mass genocide. He abandoned his human identity altogether and officially adopted the title Dracula. This was the end of his human form as Mathias Krongfist. In short, Mathias accumulated a lot of power and became Dracula during that time. Dracula already possessed centuries of accumulated power, and now he was seeking vengeance. When Dracula unleashed his monster armies across Europe, It was not just about the birth of the Dark Lord, but also about completing the transformation from Mathias to Dracula. Trevor Belmont was not up against a normal vampire, but a singular immortal force who shaped Castlevania's timeline as we know it. However, it's quite funny to know that Dracula already had his supernatural power, but still waited patiently for hundreds of years to justify his hatred until it feels like destiny itself. Why everyone's afraid of the Belmonts by Trevor's time. By the time Trevor Belmont arrives on the scene in 1476, the Belmont family is already an outcast. They were not heroes anymore. People are actually scared of them. The reason was simple. For generations, the Belmonts have been known to hunt vampires and other monsters using their supernatural skills. But over time, those same supernatural skills began to seem dangerous to the ordinary people of Wallachia. Society started fearing their power and pushed them into exile. But the tables turned once again when the same people who once rejected the Belmonts begged Trevor to return and save them. This event is quite interesting to note, especially when you see that Trevor is not the first Belmont to fight vampire. He was only a result of centuries of hidden vampire hunting, but the game never fully shows this. In all probability, the Belmont family's time in exile was spent fighting battles. Gradually, they became such legends who were feared as much as respected. The games that used to live in the gap, but not Retconned. The mystery grows even bigger because some older games like Castlevania Legend seem to fill this timeline gap between Leon Belmont in 1094 and Trevor Belmont in 1476. The biggest one was Castlevania Legends, which is set around 1450 and follows the story of Sonia Belmont. As a Belmont descendant, Sonia continued the family's vampire hunting legacy. Other older chronologies also placed the game almost equally between Leon and Trevor. This showed how Belmont power and reputation evolved across centuries. But all this changed in 2006 when Konami released an official timeline. Certain titles were quietly removed from canon and were now declared alternate continuity or simply omitted. This retcon had a major narrative effect on Belmont history. Most of that period was intentionally left blank. As a result, the Belmont history between 1094 and 1476 remains unknown. But the lack of canon material doesn't mean lack of action. During that time, Belmonts were building their legacy with constant battles, and centuries later, Trevor becomes the heir of this forgotten legacy. So this was the missing Belmont history from 1094 to 1476. Lots had happened between Lament of Innocence and Castlevania 3. You might not have known it till now, but now you do. And it's important to know that because of the complete story perspective it provides. The true story of how Belmonts became associated with a vampire killer and the story of how Dracula gained his power in the meantime, that's a lot to know, and it's fascinating.